Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Michael Jackson moonwalks onto the big screen in Antoine Fuqua's biopic. In 1968, 10-year-old Michael Jackson, played as a child by Giuliano Valdi, became the breakout star at the Jackson 5, under the management of his domineering and abusive father Joe, played by Coleman Domingo. As Michael grows into adulthood, now played by Jafar Jackson, he yearns to start a solo career, but even as he becomes the biggest pop performer of all time, Joe refuses to relinquish his control over him. When Bohemian Rhapsody released in 2018, it was an enormous success, led by Rami Malek's performance as Freddie Mercury, and led to a huge resurgence in interest in Mercury and Queen, but it also codified the format of the modern music biopic. These kind of movies are notoriously formulaic, and were absolutely mercilessly sent up in 2008's sadly underseen spoof, Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, a film which has only got better and more accurate with each passing year, and the more of these films we get. In the years since Bohemian Rhapsody, we've had movies about Elton John, Elvis, Whitney Houston, Bob Dylan, David Bowie, and many others. And now, some of those movies are good, but there's also no denying that these films, most of which were made with the involvement of the artists featured or their estate, are visualised versions of official biography. They may touch upon their tumultuous private lives, especially if it's already well known, but there's usually a little deeper insight further than what's already in the public domain. And this new wave of music biopics has coincided with a number of concert films and streaming documentaries that function very similarly as a form of reputation control, and in some cases, rehabilitation. In an era where cinema increasingly has to feel like an event, these movies feel like concerts for fans who are unable to afford the extortionate ticket prices. If films are empathy machines, as Roger Ebert once famously put it, then these biopics and docs put that machine in service of the record label's industrial complex. They offer the appearance of intimacy and behind the scenes for adoring fans, but they're just as stage managed as any performance, smoothing and glossing over any of the uncomfortable stuff that they don't want them to see. It's inevitable that Michael Jackson's life will be turned into a film, given he's one of the most iconic acts of all time, but just as inevitably, like everything else in Jackson's later life and posthumously, it will be fraught with controversy. Now, Michael Jackson isn't the only musician who leaves behind a deeply divisive legacy. I'm looking at you, Elvis, but he is by far the biggest example. And even years after his sudden death on the eve of a potential comeback, his reputation continues to be damaged. The estate might have managed to pull Leaving Neverland from HBO, effectively making it unable to be seen legally in the US, but the impact of that and the numerous trials and accusations cast a very long shadow. And regardless of whether you're one of those people who adamantly defends Jackson, even without them, as a child of the 90s, the Michael that I knew was more defined by his tabloid notoriety and baby dangling instance than by his music at that point. But clearly there is still an appetite for Michael Jackson, at least by some, as the 2022 Broadway jukebox musical MJ was a big success. Now that play ends just before the allegations in the early 90s, and was apparently a major reason why the estate decided to go ahead with making a film about him now. So it's not a surprise then that this film would exist as a vehicle to launder the reputation of its subject, because that's the entire point for the estate. It's more just how brazen and obvious it is about that. And the funny thing is, it wasn't originally like that. The script is written by John Logan, who penned Skyfall and Star Trek Nemesis, and as reported on by Variety, the movie was originally going to confront Michael's accusations directly. The movie was going to open with Michael looking at the man in the mirror as police approached to raid the Neverland Ranch, and a significant portion of it was going to cover the 1993 trial with Jordan Chandler. Presumably it would side with Jackson and depict it as an extortion attempt. It turns out there was a clause in the settlement with Chandler that meant that he could not be depicted or mentioned in any film whatsoever to prevent him from being mischaracterised. And in a delicious bit of irony, given how litigious we've established Michael's estate is, they didn't realise this until after principal photography. Oops. Needless to say, this necessitated huge changes to the film, pushing back the release date an entire year while they did extensive and expensive reshoots that the estate had to foot the bill for. And the amusing part is that this is a total tactical error, because if you or I were in the position of making a movie about Michael Jackson in a positive light, why would you even directly reference this stuff? If you were trying to be on the defensive, you've still got the spectre of allegations of one of the worst things a human being can do to one another. You want the audience to not be thinking of that, ideally. So now the legally approved version of Michael that has finally arrived in cinemas is pretty much what it should have been all along. Sure, it's clearly a patchwork to make up for the fact that it lost the entire last act, and boy is that obvious watching it, but it doesn't even mention that stuff because it doesn't even get to that point. Arguably the best option in a no-win scenario. If you're going to make a hagiography, at least commit to it. And that's what they did when they were forced to. It's basically the music biopic equivalent of the Babe Ruth story. And if I seem to be talking a lot about what's not in the movie, then that's mostly because it's a film that's almost entirely defined by the stuff that is missing from it in various ways. Not just the massive portion of the film that they junked, but other stuff too. A lot of that is more interesting than what they did include for the most part. So the narrative that has been thrust upon the film is that it's the story of his finding his independence away from his cruel father and refusing to be defined by him. It's a conventional story, but it works. You can make a compelling film about that. But they don't. Partly because it wasn't made with that intent. It was only meant to be a piece, not the whole. Joe is clearly the villain of the story, and in one of the few shocking moments in an otherwise innocuous film is that we see him beating Michael with a belt. He is a cruel man who derives his power from threatening everyone around him, and violent when challenged. His behaviour is directly responsible for the insecurities that would beset Michael in his later life, as seen when he calls Michael Big Nose, in a moment which is, ironically, a bit on the nose. And Colin Domingo does his best with what he can under some very strange looking makeup, and he gets a few scenes where he gets into Michael's head and under our skin, like when he challenges Michael about whether he wants to be surrounded by yes men, and we know that there's a bit of truth in that. But for the most part, he's an obvious one-note caricature who always has the worst response to any given situation, and he's not much of an antagonist after a certain point because Michael unceremoniously gets rid of him midway through, and then he tries to control him later through the Victory Tour. But we always know that Michael is the one that really has the power by then. One of the weirdest things about the film, though, is how little the other Jacksons are featured in it. I know Michael eclipsed them all in popularity, but none of them are characters in this movie in a real sense. They're basically glorified extras who might not have more than a handful of lines altogether, who mostly exist as backing singers. And that's peculiar given that several of them are executive producers on the film. There's a massive missed opportunity here to explore the relationships that he had with his brothers or his sister Latoya, or how they responded to the abuse directed towards him, or the loyalty that Michael felt towards them. That could easily flesh out the whole film, but it is totally, completely absent in a movie which has significant focus on his family dynamics. Something else which is absent, though, is Janet Jackson, who became a megastar in her own right, but she simply does not exist at all in the world of this film because she did not want to be featured in it. So the only other significant Jackson aside from Joe and Michael is his mother Catherine, played by Nia Long, who is supportive and caring towards him. There's lots of scenes of them watching old movies together, like Singing in the Rain, that are clearly nods to what Michael would later use in his performances. Long arguably gets something resembling a subplot where she gradually stands up to her husband and feels some guilt for not protecting Michael enough, but most of the time she's largely called upon to watch her son with pride. And that is primarily the role of much of the supporting cast, be it K.E. Durrell Jones as bodyguard and confidant Bill Bray, to Miles Teller as his lawyer and manager John Branca. They're there to look at Michael and just sagely nod in approval. Branca, incidentally, is one of the producers and the co-executor of his estate to this very day. By far the strongest thing about the movie is Jafar Jackson playing his own uncle, which is a truly inspired bit of casting, because really the only other person who could truly emulate Michael is another Jackson. And Jafar is often downright uncanny in his performance. He gets all the mannerisms and the voice down perfectly. Giuliano Valdi is also suitably adorable as younger Michael in his Jackson 5 days. But Jafar is very rarely asked by the script to actually get into his uncle's psyche, largely because there's very little real conflict after Michael earns his independence. every choice Michael makes is the right one, and everything turns out brilliantly. The one major setback Michael suffers is the infamous 1984 incident where his scalp was severely burned after an accident filming a Pepsi commercial. That would cause him to extensively use painkillers, something which the movie does gesture towards, but again doesn't commit to. There could be a narrative about Michael dealing with his pain privately as he tries to continue his professional career, but the movie avoids it once more. We get a few scenes of him recuperating in hospital, and then it just cuts to him on the victory tour later in the year. It's almost like the film isn't just avoiding controversy, it's completely conflict averse. Michael is depicted as practically a saint. In fact, it goes to great lengths to try and satirize his image that it comes back around to being a bit creepy and strange. He accumulates a growing menagerie of animals, almost all of which are CGI, including Bubbles the chimp, who gets a big dramatic entrance here. If I learnt anything from watching Michael, is that it's almost impossible to take any scene with Bubbles the chimp seriously, especially when they play like the scenes from Gordy's home in Nope. One of these Bubbles moments is one of several instances where Michael reads from a Peter Pan storybook to him, and the illustrations in this book appear to have been specifically designed to have Peter resemble Michael from the 2000s, so he's looking at that, and then he's looking at himself on the cover of Off the Wall, and he's going, and that's how he gets the idea for his first nose job. I'm not making this up. And that storybook keeps popping up as he keeps talking about his plans for, you guessed it, Neverland. And again, the ghost of who Michael Jackson would become in his later years looms large, as much as the movie wants to avoid it. There's also the fact that a not inconsiderable amount of the running time is Michael personally visiting sick children on hospital wards, which makes for decidedly uncomfortable viewing if you even have a passing familiarity with the accusations towards him, or the several occasions we see Mickey Mouse memorabilia and clothing, or that scene where he goes on a spending spree in a toy store. These scenes are so tone-deaf that they're practically inviting someone to cut them together into a horror movie trailer with sinister music. Maybe that's why the film increasingly focuses on his music. Certainly the strongest stretch is where it focuses on Michael creating the album Thriller and the creative process behind it, not least of which because it allows him to do recreations of the videos and dance moves, which Jafar replicates perfectly. And yes, that does include the title track's iconic video, which you might recall was directed by controversial Twilight Zone the movie helmer John Landis, who they've gone to the effort of hiring an excellent lookalike for, despite being mostly obscured and having hardly any dialogue. I mean, if you didn't want to depict him, why didn't you just make him a generic director? The concert scenes are also spectacular and flashily photographed, but that's the only real time you get a sense that this was directed by Antoine Fuqua, best known for Training Day in the Equalizer franchise, who otherwise seems to be working for hire. If there is an authorial intent, then that would be the Jackson estate, and especially Bohemian Rhapsody producer Graham King, as it is clear the mandate was just to replicate that film, but with Michael Jackson. How else to explain why Mike Myers once again pops up in a cameo as a record executive, this time playing CBS Records president Walter Yetnikov? At least in Bohemian it was a reference to Wayne's World. Here it just seems like he's here to reference the earlier biopic. And once again Myers' presence is distractingly out of place as he plays it like a comedy sketch, as he personally calls up MTV to strong-arm them into playing Michael's videos at a time when the station notoriously didn't play black artists. Oh look, another potential dramatic conflict the movie could have focused on. Luckily Walter and Michael managed to solve racism in just one single scene. And as the movie increasingly goes on, the more it devolves into long montages and performances. I'm sure the target audience won't complain because this is the stuff they really want to see, and maybe deep down what they actually want is a pseudo-concert film rather than anything with the pretense of narrative. But it also gives the impression of a movie which is trying to ride out the clock with the footage that they can still use, especially because for all that time they spent reworking the film with 4 credited editors trying to do triage, it doesn't have an ending. It just crashes to an abrupt halt. The last scene of the movie is Michael at Wembley performing Bad on stage, which is already jarring because the movie has just done a massive time jump from the Victory Tour in '84 to this. So they skipped over 4 years at the height of his career just for the sake of one song and then cut to black. The movie concludes with a title card that says, "His story continues. Roll credits." It's the most hilariously abrupt ending since The Devil Inside. Obviously this is meant to be a tease for a sequel, and the filmmakers have said they plan to use some of the discarded footage in that, but apparently Apparently they never came up with a better ending than just 3 words which simultaneously A, make him sound like the Messiah, B, weirdly implies that Michael Jackson is still alive, and C, sounds more like a threat. And what kind of sequel bait is that anyway? Yeah, come back for part 2, where his career and reputation is derailed by personal scandal and heinous accusations, puts himself in debt, and then dies on the eve of a comeback. That might be the least enticing prospect of all time. Maybe they should have taken a page out of Walk Hard and just ended it with a caption, Michael Jackson died 3 minutes after this performance. Michael the film arrives as a misshapen mess that clearly shows its numerous post-production difficulties, as you would expect of a film that had to jettison its entire framing device after the fact. I do think it could make a great film about Michael Jackson, because on the one hand, he was an exceptional and hugely influential musician that was once the most famous celebrity in the world. On the other hand, he was a victim of abuse who lost his childhood to fame and was clearly a very damaged person privately and has repeatedly been accused of continuing that cycle of abuse. But this was never going to be that movie, not with the estate involved. I doubt that movie would ever get made, in all honesty, but Michael isn't even the best version of what it is, paling in comparison to numerous documentaries on the subject. Michael's own daughter Paris was not involved with the film and called the script sugar-coated. I'd go one step further. It's all sugar. It's cinematic candy floss and just as fluffy and insubstantial. It's not a movie that's going to change your opinion of the divisive pop star, but even his fans might notice the absences and major dramatic liberties the film makes. I do find it very ironic that attached to the film is a special trailer for the upcoming Scary Movie, which is making innuendos about how Michael Jackson touched his fans. So even on a movie deliberately designed to avoid it, that's still inescapable. That trailer's arguably more subversive than the terrible looking spoof itself will likely be. But even overlooking the elephant in the room, and even with the music and Jafar Jackson's comedic performance, it's a drama that's only slightly less fantastical than Moonwalker. Who's bad? This movie, that's what. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip on my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature which is right below the video. Or you can moonwalk over to my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and hype the video, it really does help. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.